He stood still under the pale blue glow of the evening sun reflecting off the snow that had fallen days prior. The creaking of his bow as he drew made him nervous. The thought of the deer escaping made the pain in his stomach surge as he released. The slight hesitation caused him to pull the bow to the left. He watched the arrow fly through the air, the pain in his stomach at its height with the thought of finally being able to eat. But then he saw it. The arrow did not make it on its intended trajectory. It clipped the deer just above the back of its knee, causing it to run off. However, it also caused it to bleed. He smirked, knowing that he would, at the very least, be able to track the animal wherever it went. Seconds later, the smirk turned to a grimace as he felt the pain of his stomach return. The blistering cold of the wind bit at his face as he trudged through the snow, searching for every red dot he could find while he tracked the animal, until he heard the sound of snow being crushed under heavy feet. Crunch, crunch, crunch. He heard it clear as day. He stopped in his tracks and looked around. He saw nothing, and eventually he heard nothing, but he still felt the pain in his stomach that pushed him ever onward toward his prey. He continued following the red dotting of the snow, stopping every so often at the sound of a crunch. It must be another animal, he thought, as he trudged along, until, eventually, after another crunch of snow, he finally saw something. A figure, something he could barely describe with his own thoughts, but as quickly as he saw it, it vanished. He continued to follow the red dots that had dropped in the deer's path, like rose petals leading him to his salvation, until he heard the noise once again. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It was the sound of something he did not recognize, making heavy footsteps in the snow. Every time he heard the noise, he stopped, hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature that may have been stalking him, hoping it was something he could simply scare off. But this time, when he heard the crunching of the snow, he began to smell something foul, as if somebody had poured blood on a nearby fire. He checked his mouth with his hand. He expected to find blood, but there was none. The taste and smell of blood had filled the world around him. He felt utterly helpless. He had an inane sense that something was out there, in the dense forest, but the pain in his stomach pushed him onward. He knew he would either find the deer and kill it, or something in this forest would kill him. He knew if he turned back he was going to die, so this was no time to be a coward. As he made his way through the forest, he began to feel the cold of the melting snow seep into his shoes, something he figured he should have felt a while ago. But for now, the pain in his stomach had subsided, and he was able to feel the other aches and pains of his body. He kept tracking the red bits of snow that dotted the forest until he once again heard the noise. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound of snow beneath heavy feet. He checked his surroundings, looked left, looked right, and saw nothing. That was until he looked straight ahead. There it was, the creature that had been stalking him for so long. He merely saw a shadow of the thing, something that looked so unnatural yet so human. It had the same limbs as a human, 2 legs and 2 arms, yet the proportions were of nothing he'd ever seen. Legs so long they may have been as tall as he was, but the arms dangled in a way he didn't recognize, far longer than anything familiar, and the fingers of the creature even longer. They were long enough to reach the snow while the creature stood entirely upright. The back of this creature was strange as well, looking like a deformed child. The creature had a large hump on its back, covered in what seemed to be spikes or maybe branches. It was hard to tell in the soft glow of the overcast sky, but he was paralyzed by the sight of this creature. He sat there, staring at the thing, stunned in fear. He gazed upon the creature with the intent to watch its every move, but a moment later the beast turned its head. As it turned, he began to see it more clearly. This thing had no face, not one he could recognize anyway. The part of its body that sat atop what could be described as its neck was a swirling mass, a stuttering fiction of different colors. A shiver ran down his spine as the thing turned ever more toward him. For a moment he felt nothing. The pain that constantly ached at his stomach was nowhere to be found for the time being, but as the creature turned, it began to step toward him. However, it was in no way the cadence of a human walk. The creature began stuttering, but not in the way a man with a limp would. It was as if the creature was seizing through time and space. The man knew of nothing else, so in an attempt to defend himself he drew his bow, found where he hoped the creature would appear next, and released. The arrow soared through the air, right where the creature had just appeared. The man was hopeful. He could see the arrow was going to land true, right where he had hoped it would. However, just as the arrow would have met the flesh of the creature, it was gone, almost as if it had melted like a darkened piece of ice in the summer sun. It went from a fully formed creature into something he could only try to describe as a liquid. Though it seemed gelatin-like, the black liquid stretched and rushed across the snow. Only after the arrow had passed, the gelatin-like black liquid reformed, and hundreds of separate bits of the liquid transformed into creatures he did recognize. Spiders. 8-legged creatures that scurried along the top of the hardened snow, up into the trees and then gone from view. He felt as though his insides had turned to liquid. The fear in his mind battled intensely with the pain in his stomach over whether or not he should press forward in his search for the deer. But he knew what he had to do. If he turned back now, he would die. So he trudged on, moving more carefully and paranoid than ever. hoping he had not just seen what he thought he'd seen, hoping that the hunger and exhaustion had caused him to hallucinate. As he walked, the pain in his stomach slowly surged, almost causing him to double over. His feet had gone numb from the cold long ago, which he was grateful for. He knew if he could feel them, the pain in his feet would be nearly as bad as the one in his stomach. He continued following the trail of red dots left by the animal until the awful smell of blood returned to him. He stopped dead in his tracks, took a deep breath, and once again felt paralyzed. He listened to the deathly quiet, snow-covered forest. For a moment there was nothing, until he heard it once again. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound of old snow being stamped down by heavy feet. He spun in a quick circle, searching all directions around him. He saw nothing. He decided he was no longer going to wait for the beast to reveal itself to him, and ran. He ran in the direction of the blood trail, hoping he could find the deer, kill it, and get to shelter where he could hopefully survive just a little bit longer. He could no longer hear anything over the sound of his numb feet crushing the icy snow as he ran. The taste of blood filled his mouth once again, a taste so foul it nearly caused him to gag. All these sensations left him as he reached a clearing in the forest, all of them except one. The pain in his stomach was still with him, as it had been for so long now. He took a moment to catch his breath, bent over with his hands on his knees, and he felt his vision begin to fade. He shook it off and looked up, and there he saw it. The deer he had been searching for all this time. He stared intently at the deer. Unfortunately, it stared intently back. He tried to slowly grab his bow, but the pain in his stomach wouldn't allow it. The wretched feeling he had there forced him to be quick. It forced him to act on it in an instant. And when the deer saw this sudden movement, it took off. The deer quickly found the cave that sat behind it and sprinted inside. The vicious bite of starvation reared within him in a way he'd never felt before. After seeing his one possibility of salvation run away once again, it was unbearable. Knowing the only chance he now had was following the deer into that cave, even more so. He knew what he needed to do. The only thing he could do. He picked himself up out of the snow and forced himself to walk towards the cave, his numb feet moving slowly but intently. He understood what would happen if the deer were to escape him once again, so he took as much care as his body would allow, doing everything he could to not startle the deer again. When he reached the cave, he peered into its never-ending darkness, an abyss in which he knew he would return from victorious or not at all. As he searched the darkness, he heard the subtle noise of hooves walking carefully on stone. This gave him the motivation to take his first step into the cave. At first, he was frightened, afraid of what might lie beyond the darkness. But as he continued to venture into the cave, he realized the slightly damp stone walls were actually a nice respite from the cold of the biting wind and snow outside. He used the light from outside and the small clicks of hooves on stone to make his way through the winding cavern. The farther he made it into the cave, the more the feeling of relief subsided, and the more the pain and fear crept back. He began to feel as though he had lost his way, that he had forgotten the whole reason he entered the cave in the first place. He didn't realize that he had made it to a point in the cave where he could no longer see the entrance. He began to realize that the pain in his stomach had mysteriously left him. Before he had time to understand why, he felt a sudden shock to his brain. A wave of fear washed over him so thick it may have manifested itself as a tidal wave of molasses. The taste was back. That awful taste of blood filled his mouth. The smell was back, but most of all the fear. The fear was back. He was stunned for a sharp but brief moment. Unsure of what to do, he frantically looked around, but his eyes could not pierce the black void that surrounded him. He felt the muscles in his legs break free of the paralysis, like ice shattering off the branch of a tree. He was able to run, so he turned toward the direction he hoped he had come from and darted forward. He didn't make it more than a few steps before he was stopped in his tracks. A strong grip around his throat forced him to stop as he was lifted into the air. He felt nothing physical around his neck, as if an ethereal hand had reached through his skin and grabbed his throat itself. As he hung suspended in the air, he felt small, thin tendrils creeping up and wrapping themselves around his legs. He attempted to shake them off, but his attempts were futile. He could feel them, though. They felt nothing like flesh. They were hard and rigid as if they were made of wood. They squeezed his legs tighter and tighter until he began to lose feeling in them. All the while he felt the tendrils slowly creeping up his legs and around to his back. In an instant he felt a sharp, piercing pain in his back. One of the tendrils had stabbed through his clothes, through his skin, and into the lower part of his spine. His legs, once writhing in agony, attempting to break free, the tendrils had gone limp. He tried to scream from the pain of being stabbed, but the grip around his throat was far too tight for that. His arms, which were once wrestling against the tendrils, had now been restrained by them, and he began to see a faint glow. He didn't know where the glow was coming from, but it allowed him to see the thing he feared so much. He saw the face, which really was no face at all, a swirling mass of stuttering and constantly shifting colors. Staring deeply into the face of this creature, he saw it moving what he considered to be an arm, an extremely long and skinny limb that looked almost fragile. He saw the hand of the creature, each appendage looking like the branch of a tree. He felt all 8 of them slither slowly across his scalp before finding a place to rest. He felt the agony as each appendage slowly forced its way through his scalp and through his skull. He tried to scream for a second time, but again there was no sound to be heard. Once each appendage was solidly locked in place, he felt them begin to pull. He could hear the cracking of his own skull as it fractured again and again. That was until it was entirely pulled off. He could see what he believed to be the face of the creature moving up and over its head, almost as if it were inspecting the gray matter contained in what was once his skull. But it wasn't inspecting. As the creature leaned over the man's exposed brain, its face began to melt, slowly dripping bits of its own flesh onto it. In an instant, or maybe an eternity, he really couldn't tell the difference anymore. The man found himself being able to see everything. He found himself floating in the black void that held all the celestial bodies he had looked up to when he was down on Earth. He saw the exploding of stars, the formation of new ones, and the collapse of old ones. And then he saw nothing. As if all time in the universe had rushed through him in an instant, he found himself alone in a dark void of true and complete nothingness.